Tonight on Free Minds TV, we'll be talking about Fannie Mae, an unfortunate shooting incident in Afghanistan. We'll also be talking about wasteful spending by the Department of Defense and the reversal of a decision in Indiana about police searches. Coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
Welcome everyone to episode 245 of Free Minds TV, where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. With you as always is Toby.
And Nick.
We have quite a bit to get into tonight. We're going to be talking about the story that's been in the headlines last week about the soldier in Afghanistan who allegedly went around and just shot up a bunch of innocent people. By the time you're watching this, maybe more got out and we realized he had a brain tumor or something. I don't know. Very unfortunate incident that I'm sure there's going to be plenty of ramifications for us. So while you probably heard the story, you'll get our take on it, as well as some good news coming out of Indiana with what the legislative body is doing there about the police searches. We touched on a court decision out there a few months back where the courts ruled that police have a right to enter your home even if it's unlawful and you cannot resist them. You get arrested for that.
Right. I think that was actually the Supreme Court of the state of Indiana that had made that ruling. So there wasn't much that they could do about it except to try to reverse that process on the statewide level. And so basically what they had to do was go to the legislature to actually overturn what the Supreme Court had said.
Yeah, and we'll get into that. But first I want to talk about, well, it's a story that I guess it would be big news if it wasn't just the American people just seem completely sick of it now, so it kind of is going by the wayside. Actually, the story that I'm coming from is a couple of weeks old. It's coming from Leap Day, February 29th, but I just stumbled across it in my show content search tonight. It's about Fannie Mae wanting more money from the government. Now, this should be a big deal because we're talking about billions and billions of dollars here. It's not a big deal, I think, because we've already given them billions and billions of dollars. Well, let's be honest about it. We haven't given them billions and billions of dollars. The future generations have, because this isn't taxpayer money. This is borrowed future generations' taxpayer money. So all the references in here, this article where they're like, the taxpayers have bailed out Freddie. No, they've borrowed money to bail out Freddie. Yeah, we'll be paying interest on it. So will grandkids and grandkids and grandkids. So when we say tax money, it's maybe a little bit. Anyways, let's get into the story. This coming from the AP. Mortgage giant Fannie Mae said Wednesday that it lost money in the fourth quarter and is asking the federal government for nearly $4.6 billion in aid to cover its deficits. Washington, D.C.-based Fannie said it lost roughly $2.4 billion in the October-December quarter, stung by declining home prices. Revenue was about $4.5 billion. I wonder why they need some more. Anyways, the government rescued Fannie and sibling company Freddie Mac in September of 2008 to cover their losses on soured mortgage loans. Since then, a federal regulator, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, has controlled their financial decisions. Taxpayers have spent more than $150 billion to prop up Fannie and Freddie, the most expensive bailout of the 2008 financial crisis. The government estimates that the figure could top $259 billion to support the companies through 2014 after subtracting dividend payments to the federal government. Fannie has received more than $116 billion so far from the Treasury Department, the most expensive bailout of a single company. Little bit of positive news. I don't know how much it's positive, how it will turn out. But this article says going down, the Obama administration unveiled a plan 1 year ago, which I know we did touch on, but not too much has happened so far. We'll see how it goes over the next couple of years. Unveiled a plan 1 year ago to slowly dissolve the two mortgage giants. The aim to shrink the government's role in mortgage systems, remaking a decade of federal policy aimed at getting Americans to buy homes. It would also probably make home loans more expensive. And while they did that a year ago, so far, the government has still been trying to get people to buy up these homes, right? Reducing interest rates and the like. So we'll see how it works. Exactly how far the government role in mortgage lending would be reduced was left up to Congress to decide, but all three options, and they referenced a couple more useless ones here, presented would create housing finance systems that relies more on private money, which would be nice, but I just don't see it going in that direction right now, Nick, and I don't know.
Well, I mean, you have to be profoundly bad at lending money to lose money making home loans. I mean, you have to make some seriously flawed home loans. And I think really one of the issues you look at, I mean, they mention it in the story, is that if the government did back out of the business of making home loans, making loans for mortgages, that the price would go up. Well, you have to consider the fact that right now we're looking at the cost to finance a mortgage is somewhere around 4% fixed, 4 or 5% fixed. That's nuts. I mean, and that's with zero money down or a couple percentage points down on the house. If you look at the reasons why the housing bubble got overinflated in the way that it did, it's largely because we had these entities here backing the idea of a 30-year mortgage, which is somewhat excessive, actually. It makes it somewhat excessively easy to borrow. It's not something that the market would have set. You had them doing this with 0% down, or I think some FHA loans were 3% down, which is nothing by historical terms or by market terms. So you've got a housing finance system here where the government intervened to make housing more affordable for everybody. They made it too affordable. Imagine if they did this with automobiles and you needed zero money down to buy a car and you could finance at 3 or 4%. Would that lead to a bubble in car purchases? I think it probably would. I don't know what's so special about housing and why the federal government thinks it has some role to play in lending people money to buy homes.
Yeah, and that's why I'm so skeptical, and a year later it's played out exactly how I think we said it would, of the Obama administration saying that they're going to be slowly getting the government out of the role of mortgages. I shouldn't have been able to get a mortgage, Nick, a couple of years ago, but I did. I'm paying money on it. Look, like, I am responsible. Credit-wise, though, and money-wise, they should have made me wait a couple of years and saved up more money for a down payment. I mean, in all honesty, that's how it should have gone. And so I can easily see how people got wrapped up in these back mortgages. And why I think it's important to bring up, Nick, is because they're not done. Their mortgage rates are going down, and while the federal government and Obama administration is saying, well, we're working on getting out of it, they're going the opposite direction still. And so it's largely, I think, being pulled back from the forefront of people's minds when still billions of dollars are being spent on it.
Part of the problem is that the housing market we have now is artificial, and you're right. I mean, you were saying you borrowed to buy a home, and if it was the market setting the rates, you probably would not have been able to buy the home.
Getting a home right now instead of a couple of years ago. Right,
when you did. And that's the thing. A lot of people will say that government intervention is necessary to promote home ownership, and then they'll talk about all of the benefits that home ownership has for society. But I think we have to remember, if the government had not intervened and made it artificially easy to finance the purchase of a home over 30 years with 0% down, housing prices would be lower. And it's the same argument that people make, saying, well, we can't get rid of these entities because it would collapse the housing market. Well, yes, it would. It would collapse the bubble that still remains in the housing market. It would collapse the artificial market in housing back to a sustainable level where you had market-based financing. And that's not popular, of course, because a lot of people out there own homes. If you own a home, you have a vested interest in keeping an artificial market in place. But if you look at what housing prices actually represent, they represent an inflated price. And that's why it's so difficult for a lot of young people, especially today, Toby, to afford homes. I mean, young people moving back in at home or renting as opposed to buying homes. There was some information out this year about, I think, the first quarter of 2012. I think only 50% of home buyers were first-time buyers, whereas I think a year ago or 2 years ago, it was about 2/3 of the market. And there's a reason for that. It's, these sticker prices on homes are just not realistic. They're not based on, a market demand for housing where you have market pressures when it comes to financing. And so I'm sorry, you make it more difficult for people to afford a home? Yeah, fewer people can buy a home. There's less demand, fewer qualified buyers, lower home prices, which in some ways is better for everybody.
Yeah. Well, so is that the solution, Nick?
If you want more affordable housing in the long run, yeah.
So
I mean, if you want to make it so that people can afford to buy artificially expensive homes in the short run and for perpetuity, then by all means, keep the government involved.
All right, so is there a way to fix this without making it painful for the average homeowner?
No, probably not.
Okay.
But they have a lot of slight correction to this point, and it has been painful because a lot of people are upside down. So it's not that they have not allowed any correction at all, Toby. I just like to see them allow a correction to the point where home prices are based on what individual people can borrow from private financial institutions to purchase a home. And it would require a lot more money down. They'd be shorter terms. Basically, in principle, more expensive for an individual consumer, which would mean they could buy less house, which would mean housing prices would have to correct down, which means really means more affordable housing in the long run. It's bad
because, for example,
right.
if take my situation, yes, I would only be buying a house probably about now instead of 2 years ago. But what would that mean in the long run? Well, in the long run, it would mean that I'd be probably having a 15-year mortgage instead of a 30-year mortgage, and I'd have way more money in my bank account. Do I regret my decision? Absolutely not. I'm living in the moment. I want to live the American dream now, not in 2 years. Gosh darn it. I want my white picket fence. But would it have been that bad to wait 2 years? Realistically, no. But if the easy home's there, yeah, of course I'm going to get it. That's what I want. Also being said, the reason I would have been able to save more money is because it was much cheaper to rent. Because, like you said, the artificial price of homes, they are priced higher than they should be.
But when you look over the long run, too, as you pointed out, a 15-year mortgage as opposed to a 30-year mortgage, in the long run, what's best for the working class or consumers that these government programs are really intended to help? Well, when you look at the amount of money you pay just in interest on a 30-year note versus a 15-year fixed note, you're going to be spending, in many cases, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to a financial institution for no purpose other than the fact that you're servicing a lower monthly payment, a longer repayment period, and really what you're doing is you're lining the pockets of Wall Street and bankers. And I think that government intervention in the housing market, while well-intentioned, really is one of the best examples of what happens when the government tries to intervene on behalf of the working class, make housing affordable or make another commodity affordable. They've done it in healthcare too, where they intervene and basically they cause an artificial market, they cause price inflation in that sector. We've seen it with tuition costs too. They just don't do a very effective job, and I think ultimately if you look at what's really killing the middle class, Toby, it's mortgage payments, tuition payments, and healthcare payments. And if you take healthcare, tuition, and housing out of the picture, the middle class would be in far better shape in this country, regardless of what the job market looked like.
It's like 75% of my household income goes to one of those
Those
three.
are the three areas where the government has been involved in heavy intervention in the name of helping out working people or poor people. And it hasn't worked at all. Prices have exploded in those areas.
And also the inflation, part of the inflation is the fact that you're borrowing money for it. Yeah, I'm not paying that much on my mortgage payment. It's the interest on the mortgage payment. That's where most of my money,
you're not paying
monthly
down
payment
much of
goes.
the principal.
Same with my student loans.
Right.
The student loans, it's interest payments I'm making. So, yeah, it's, oh well, what are you going to do? Let's talk about other areas that we've put most people to sleep. It's financial matters, but hey, it's probably what affects you more than any other story we talk
paying
about.
For your house is probably your biggest expense in your life. So
it's funny how
about how that works is important.
The topics that make people's eyes glaze over really are the ones that matter most. Maybe that's why we've let them get that far, is because they're boring to talk about. But shouldn't it make you mad that the Fannie and Freddie and these other people are getting billions of dollars?
I mean, why not just give the money directly to American homeowners?
Right. I don't know.
Why not just give $10,000 to everyone who has a loan with them, and that would be your program to help them out? Makes sense to me.
Let's talk about the big story in the news. Let's go over to Afghanistan and talk about the soldier who went on a little bit of a shooting spree there.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate story. A U.S. Army sergeant went on a shooting spree in Afghanistan, killing at least 16 civilians, 9 of them children. I believe the report said 3 or 4 of them were women, too, so mostly women and children. This happened in a rural stretch of southern Afghanistan early on Sunday, and there's legitimate concern about a backlash from the Afghan people as a reaction to this shooting. Now, this individual was not acting under orders or anything like that. This incident really isn't something that happened directly as a result of U.S. policy, beyond the fact that there is a U.S. policy of continuing the occupation in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, when you put, and I'm not trying to excuse the incident here, but it is somewhat predictable, and massacres like this often happen in war zones because people snap. I mean, you put them in a war zone, you tell them to shoot certain Afghans, you put them in a position where they're being shot at, perhaps they saw their friends being killed, and then you expect them not to have a meltdown. And to be honest, Toby, I think this is a terrible story, but in some ways I'm always surprised that incidents like this happen as infrequently as they do. Maybe they happen more often and they just don't get reported. I mean, if this happened in an isolated village away from a command post, would it have been reported? I don't know, but I am surprised that you only hear about these incidents once or twice a year when you consider the fact that people in the U.S. Army or the Marines or anybody else, they're human, and being in a combat situation like that, where they have killed people and that's essentially their job, and they've seen people close to them get killed, it's surprising to me that this isn't happening more frequently.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of harkens back to the story a few months back of the soldiers, the pictures of the soldiers peeing on the dead corpses. Which is
probably a much lesser offense.
But I'm sure that
the fact that they were people they were supposed to kill and they were already dead.
When I was reading that story, I was thinking that probably has been happening throughout history. Just now that there's digital cameras everybody has now, there's starting to be pictures of that. Same with the stuff that was going on many years ago and with the Gitmo detainees and that kind of stuff with the dehumanizing type torture pictures that they had. I'm sure this has been going on because this is what war makes people do, unfortunately. So I say the best solution to that is let's not be in these silly conflicts. I guess that's just me as a crazy person, but I say that there would probably be better solutions than intervening all over the world, because then we wouldn't have to be doing stuff like this.
Right. I mean, you're correct, and you know, I mean, it's easy. I think a lot of people are going to, just talk about, well, that's just a crazy person, and that may be true. I mean, the person probably did have some emotional problems.
Absolutely a crazy person.
A well-adjusted person, even in a high-stress situation, their reaction would not be to go around and massacre 16 civilians. It just, sorry, as we pointed out, does not happen all the time, and it's kind of a lot of people have been through combat. Even some of the ones who are not particularly well-adjusted don't go around and murder large quantities of civilians. But yeah, I mean, I think ultimately what you're looking at here, Toby, is underlying this is a policy debate. And the U.S. is still occupying Afghanistan. They're still fighting a counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. And if that was not happening, then we would not have U.S. soldiers in harm's way melting down and killing civilians. I mean, this is one of the consequences of waging a war, whether you like it or not.
This is only probably, like you said, only going to be making matters worse. I mean, let's flip it around. What if this had happened here and it was an occupying force that was here in the United States and supposedly to protect the American people and all, free us of our oppressive, well, I guess it's not a government, but sects of rogue forces out there. Let's say it was another country occupying us, and one of their soldiers decided to go out and massacre a bunch of women and children. Would that make you want to fight back against that country and kick them out? I'm guessing yes. For a lot of you out there anyway, so it's going to have the similar effect in Afghanistan.
Right.
Especially the people who already don't really like Americans being there. Well, guess what? They really don't want them to be there now. So,
well, even if you have difficulty imagining a situation where the roles are reversed, it's also easy to say that civilian deaths like this, excesses by an occupying force, are what any insurgency, whether they're, religious fundamentalists in Afghanistan or Marxists or whoever they are, any insurgency, regardless of their ideological affiliation, they feed off, I mean, propaganda is very important, so they feed off of high-profile abuses like this, and it doesn't matter whether it was one soldier or whether he had mental problems or whether somebody tried to stop him. From a propaganda standpoint, for the Afghani people, if you just hear about U.S. soldiers massacring civilians, that's a very, very powerful tool for the insurgency to use, as it was in our own revolution. I mean, the Boston Massacre was really, if you look at the actual historical incident, was basically a riot where they were lobbing stones and everything at British soldiers, and the soldiers basically tried to defend themselves. But for propaganda purposes, it was very useful to the American revolutionaries. And you can look back through history and you can see where there have been popular uprisings inspired by less than this, fewer than 16 deaths, Toby. I mean, it doesn't take very much from a propaganda standpoint, from a public relations standpoint, to really sour an entire population on an occupation.
Yep. But unfortunately, until America goes broke, this seems to be the way that our foreign policy will be conducted. All the presidential candidates that would ever think something different than occupying the whole globe and being the world's police, well, they're laughed at as kooks on both the Democratic and Republican side. So unfortunately, it's going to just be that all amazing dollar that finally does break this vicious cycle. But that'll hurt just as much, probably, if not much worse. It'll be painful then too. So it's kind of depressing. What are you going to do? I guess not much.
I don't know. I mean, I think you're right, though. I think economics will ultimately change the policy, not politics.
Nothing else. I mean, we've got our own media propaganda here telling the American people that we need to be in these foreign places, foreign lands, slaying foreign dragons. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, this would be happening here on American soil, right?
That's what they tell us.
All right, let's get into a little bit of good news. Indiana House of Representatives passes amendment to police entry legislation, a state bill aiming to give residents limited rights to resist police officers who enter their homes illegally, was passed by the Indiana House of Representatives on Thursday with several amendments. Then it goes on about the bill's original sponsor and author here is very upset because of all the amendments, blah, 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 blah. I guess they watered down the bill. Moving on, the bill is in direct response to an Indiana Supreme Court decision in Barnes v. State of Indiana. In that case, an Ellisville, Indiana man resisted a police officer who entered his home after receiving a call about a domestic disturbance. Although he was not charged with any other crimes, the man was charged with battery of a police officer for resisting. The state's highest court ruled that a citizen never has a right to resist an officer in pursuit of an investigation. But state lawmakers disagree. With the state's self-defense statute for unlawful entry already in place, McMillan said SB1, Senate Bill 1, would further clarify that citizens have a right to resist an officer who enters their home illegally. Quote, as a legislative body, I don't think that we are willing to sit back and say that it is appropriate to prohibit people from resisting unlawful actions that are happening, McMillan said. Quote, so we are going to pass something to address this issue. But law enforcement officers and officials across the state said that the bill is problematic and should not be passed. So we'll see. I guess it still has to go through the House and then to the governor's desk. But a little bit of good news coming out of there.
Yeah, I mean, it was a troubling court decision, and I guess the legislature is finally responding. And to be honest, Toby, I was kind of doubtful that there was going to be any real significant pushback on that at all. I thought it would just be one of those, oh, well,
I thought it was just going
to
be one of those things that starts to spread to other states, which it still probably will eventually, but we'll see. Anyways, did we plug about spending excess money? Do we need to get into that?
Well, it's always a good story, right?
All right.
The government's always spending money in some pretty interesting ways. Now, this story is, the actual data is coming from Reason.com, which I find to be a pretty enjoyable news source. And they point out some of the things the federal government has decided to fund. Number one would be the Republican and Democratic Party conventions at almost $18 million apiece each.
And that's
why do they need that? I thought these super PACs had tens of millions of dollars. They can't fund the conventions. The parties can't fund the conventions on their own with all of those millions floating around.
I guess I don't want to get sued here. These organizations, they act like criminals. I would say they are in many ways, but you know, it's upsetting that it seems like they're robbing that money from the American people. I don't want to be giving the Democrats or Republicans a penny of my money to have some.
Or a Republican. And there are a lot of Americans out there who wouldn't consider themselves a Democrat or a Republican.
A growing
and certainly
number.
wouldn't want to fund their convention.
What's more upsetting than anything, last week we were talking about the trespassing bill that's going through that actually threatens you up to how many years in prison for
10.
going and protesting outside one of these conventions. 10 years in jail if you go and protest outside one of these conventions.
If they want to use tax dollars to fund a party convention, which is a private, really, when you think about it, a private political club or organization, tax the voters who go to vote in the Republican primary to pay for the Republican National Convention, tax the Democratic primary voters for the DNC. You're voting in the primary, you're voting in the party's selection process. If somebody needs to fund it, it should be you who vote for that particular political party.
Yeah, 10 cents to vote. I'll pay for it.
Yeah. They also point out a number of interesting bills. One is the construction of an IHOP, that would be an International House of Pancakes, in the up-and-coming neighborhood of Columbia Heights. $800,000.
Well,
doesn't sound like much.
It's a drop in the bucket.
Why does IHOP need federal funding to build a new IHOP?
That's a very good question. An extremely good question.
I mean, they are a large company, right?
It kind of begs the question of why does Fannie need to borrow money for mortgages? I mean, like you said, you have to be very, very bad at investing in order to lose money out on these mortgages. You have to make some very poor decisions.
Yeah, lending money is about one of the biggest rackets in the world.
Same with selling pancakes in the Midwest. Or where are they building this?
Washington, D.C.
Maybe there's not as big of a demand for pancakes as I thought.
Some other good ones here. Pension payments to dead federal employees, $120 million.
To dead ones?
Yeah.
Like to their graves or to their widows?
Like they haven't canceled the payments because they didn't figure out they were dead yet.
Who's cashing the checks?
If your spouse was a federal employee and the checks kept showing up, do you think you'd find a way to cash them? I do.
All right.
Funding for video game, and a lot of people are just on direct deposit. They might be joint accounts. Funding for video game preservation at the International Center for the History of Electronic Games, $100,000.
See, that's if it's a drop in the bucket. Don't you want to see Pong memorialized in a museum?
$18 million to China for social and environmental programs.
See,
because we have all the money we need here.
Should go all the money going to China, no matter what it's for, is a joke. You know how much money? Most of a good portion, not most of, but they're one of the biggest lenders to the United States. All that deficit we talk about, well, a lot of that money comes from China. You know,
to lend
us money. Then we pay it all back in interest payments. We're never paying back the principal. We're just paying it interest payments, and we need to give them money.
Yeah, they should have plenty of money.
It's so silly. We borrow money to give them money.
Yeah.
Borrow money from them to give them money.
That is how it works.
Oh well. What are you we're out of time. I guess there's a bigger list. But the government spends money on all sorts of silly projects. Till next week, it's been Toby here with you.
And Nick.
Have a good one.